News of the Times, the Limehouse mystery, the 1867 case that divided Victorian London. Welcome to News of the Times. Limehouse, London, 1867. A woman lay dead on the floor in a blood-splattered room, her throat cut. Her lover of 6 months, along with his parents, claimed she had taken her own life. But the body was cold, and the blood already drying, and neighbours swore that they'd heard the cry of murder hours earlier. In the heart of Limehouse in 1867, a brutal killing left a working-class community stunned. The accused, a young lighterman, found with a knife wound of his own, insisted she attacked first and then turned the blade on herself. But neither the timeline nor the evidence made sense. The prosecution believed the woman had been killed hours before the alarm was raised. A twisted knife wound to the neck, a blood-splattered room, and a body already stiffening with rigor mortis. He claimed she died by her own hand just 30 minutes before the police arrived. So what really happened in that cramped Limehouse bedroom? Was it murder? Did she harm herself? Or was this a carefully staged lie involving not just the lover, but his mother and father too? Join us as we unpick the contradictions, examine the chilling post-mortem, and revisit a forgotten tragedy that shocked Victorian London. And in today's end of episode further particulars segment, on Halloween night in 1802, young Mabel Carr ventured into a dark foundry with a candle and a pocket full of hemp seed, hoping to glimpse her future husband. What she claimed to see sent her screaming. What happened next left her employer clearing his name and her family calling the doctor. So, dim the lights and settle into your favourite chair, preferably one that doesn't creak without reason. For tonight's tale winds through narrow alleys and candle-lit rooms where blood runs cold and stories shift with the telling. From the shadowy corners of Limehouse to a Halloween séance gone fatally wrong, we invite you, brave listener, to join us. The truth may be elusive, but the chill is guaranteed. Background: Limehouse, 1867. A dense tangle of alleys, wharves and warehouses. Limehouse sat on the eastern fringe of London's Docklands, a place where the city's soot-streaked buildings gave way to the grey waters of the Thames. By day it was alive with the grind and creak of commerce, barge-laden lightermen unloading cargo from tall-masted ships, the stink of fish, coal smoke and cheap gin blending in the thick industrial air. But by night, Limehouse shifted. The narrow court and crowded lodging houses grew quiet and watchful. Gaslight flickered on damp brick, and the fog rolling in from the river softened every edge until a cry or a crash would shatter the silence. It was a place of working-class resilience and hard survival, where labour was brutal and privacy scarce. Entire families often shared a single room, while boarders and tenants moved constantly in and out of cheap rented spaces. Respectability and ruin lived side by side. Agnes Oaks. Agnes Oaks was just 22 when her life was cut short in Limehouse. Born into a working family in Liverpool, she lost her mother young, When her father, an engineer by trade, left for London with two brothers, Agnes and her younger sister were left to fend for themselves. With no money and no word from their father, the two girls made the desperate decision to walk the 250 miles to London, sleeping in village workhouses along the way. When they finally reached the capital, they found no trace of their father, only hardship and uncertainty. Determined to survive, Agnes sought work and secured employment in Limehouse as a domestic servant and part-time barmaid. Those who knew her described her as a quiet, gentle and respectable, doing her best to build a life despite her loneliness and lack of protection. It was during this time that she met John Wiggins, a lighterman who frequented the public houses where she worked. Believing his promises of marriage, Agnes left her employment to live with him and his parents, a decision that would prove fatally misguided. Within 6 months, she would be dead, her throat cut in the small home they shared in one of the East End's most shocking cases of 1867. John Wiggins was a 35-year-old lighterman from Limehouse, a trade often marked by the hard labour and harder tempers. Born and raised in the East End, Wiggins lived with his parents in a modest home where space and money were in equally short supply. Described as a small and wiry, with a florid complexion and a coarse nature, Wiggins was no stranger to the rough and tumble culture of the docks. 6 months before the murder, he brought Agnes Oaks, a domestic servant more than a decade his junior, into the household as his mistress, promising marriage if she became pregnant. Their relationship quickly soured. The couple argued frequently over money, with Wiggins accusing Agnes of pawning his belongings and running up debts. Matters came to a head when she pawned a watch without permission, a quarrel so bitter it ended in the decision that she would leave the house within the week. But she never got the chance. When Agnes was found dead, her throat cut, and Wiggins wounded by a shallow stab, he insisted she had first attacked him and then taken her own life. From the Belfast Morning News, the 2nd of August, 1867, a sad story of sin and shame. Some 2 years ago, there resided at Liverpool a working man's family of the name Oaks. Either work fell short or private trouble broke up the home, for the father, an engineer by trade, went to London with his 2 sons. The mother was dead, and 2 daughters, then little more than children, were left behind to fend for themselves. No tidings came to them, things went badly, and at last, on hearing a report that their father had got employment in the Limehouse factory, the girls made up their minds to go and seek for him. They tramped down from Liverpool to London, sleeping at night in the village workhouses, and after a weary journey they reached the great city to find that their search was in vain. Nothing could be learnt of their parent, and the forlorn, helpless children were thrown penniless upon the streets. Happily, the world proved less pitiless to them than it does daily to girls in their forlorn plight. They met with some friend who had known the family in former days, and they got situations as servants in London. If we can trust the evidence given, there were quite well-behaved girls ready to work for their living. The elder of the 2, Agnes Oaks, obtained employment as a half house servant, half barmaid in different taverns at Limehouse. There's no reason to impugn the respectability of the public houses where the unfortunate woman served her time. Still, she was lonely, unprotected, and well nigh friendless, and the wonder would have been had she adhered to the strict path of virtue. In an evil hour she made the acquaintance of a man of her own class who used to frequent the house in which she served. The story after that event is so common in the rank of life to which Agnes Oaks belonged that, despite its sadness, it cannot be treated as exceptionally horrid and wicked. She began by keeping company with the man Wiggins, was seduced by him before marriage, and then went to him as his mistress, under the impression that he would marry her if she became a mother. In some sections of our working population, such an arrangement, if we may speak unpleasant truth, is far from being rare, and hence it is not surprising that the illicit connection should have received the sanction of the man's parents. Wiggins, who was a lighterman by trade, brought the girl home to the house owned by his father and mother, and occupied a room under their roof. There is no evidence as yet to show that he usually behaved with brutality towards the woman who had entrusted herself to his care. The manner and customs of longshore lightermen are rough and coarse, but notwithstanding occasional quarrels, the girl appears to have been attached to her lover. The household, however, was poor, money ran short, and it is tolerably clear that Wiggins, like many men of much better positions in similar circumstances, was anxious to rid himself of a troublesome tie. Frequent disputes arose about money. The woman pawned the man's things on her own responsibility, and he accused her of running him into debt. At last it was agreed that they should part company, and the Wednesday was fixed as the day the woman was to leave the house and shift once more for herself. So far, the facts of the case are intelligible enough. It is the sequel to this story of sin and shame which alone is surrounded with anything of mystery. As the Belfast Morning News captured the heartbreak, the Stockport Advertiser laid out the hard facts, and what they found at the scene and in court raised more questions than answers. From the Stockport Advertiser and Guardian, the 2nd of August 1867, the suspected murder at Limehouse. On Friday afternoon, Mr. Richards, the coroner, held an investigation at the Salisbury Tavern, Eastfield Street in Limehouse, on the case of Agnes Oaks, aged 22 years, who was found lying dead in a room. Inspector Brady had charge of the case and represented the commissioners of police. The first witness called was Rose Ellen Oaks, aged 14, sister of the deceased, who sobbed while giving her evidence. She is a domestic servant in the employ of John Watson, a cowkeeper on business at 62 4th Street in Limehouse. Her sister lived at Temperance Cottage in North Street. She'd been a domestic servant before she went to live with John Wiggins, a lighterman aged 35. They had been living together for the last 6 months, and Wiggins's father and mother lived in the house with them. The witness said her sister had been 2 years in London. They had walked from Liverpool all the way and slept in workhouses. They came to London in search of their father, Thomas Oaks, an engineer. He left Liverpool to go to London to get work. They last heard of him that he was working at a factory in Limehouse, and they were told that he had got married and had 3 more children, but could not trace him. When they failed to find their father, Agnes got into a place at the Crown Salmons Lane in Limehouse, and Wiggins came to see the deceased there. The witness had not seen his sister since Sunday week, when she stopped with her until 10 o'clock in the evening. They were quarrelling then about some money. The witness did not think that it was about jealousy. Wiggins did not strike her then. He threatened to strike her. He was telling his father and mother something when Agnes went to listen on the stairs, and she then went into the room, and she said that all he had stated was false. She didn't fly into a passion, but she left the room after she had spoken. So she went to the witness saying, "I have pawned a flannel shirt of his, and I must get it out, or he will be the death of me." Wiggins said, "I wish you were." Mrs. Rose H. Bunt of 186 Grundy Street, Popular, said that she had known the deceased since she was a child. She went to see her after walking from Liverpool. The family had lived in London previously. She had behaved herself with propriety while in service. She confessed to her mistress that John Wiggins had seduced her. About 6 months ago, she said that she was going to leave her situation to get married, and her mistress had not seen her alive since. She was a very meek and quiet-tempered young woman. Dr. James Horton, Divisional Surgeon of Police, was called to Temperance Cottage at about 5:30 on Wednesday morning. There, in the upper room, he found the body of Agnes Oaks lying on her back, her head beneath a chair, and the floor drenched in blood. Across her throat was a ghastly wound, jagged and semicircular, extending from below the left ear nearly to the right side of the neck. The cut was so deep that it had reached the spine, and the muscle and great arteries on the left side were severed. 2 smaller slashes ran into the main wound, and from its appearance, the doctor believed that the knife had been twisted within the throat after the first blow. Such an act, he said, would have required extraordinary strength and composure, a thing almost impossible for a woman to perform upon herself, for faintness would come on before the knife could be turned. The jagged edges of the wound bore dreadful proof of that brutal motion. The body was covered with blood, and upon one arm there was the mark of an old bruise. The inquiry was adjourned for the attendance of John Wiggins, who had stated that the deceased had cut his throat with the table knife and then nearly half severed her own head from her body. With his superficial knife wounds now healed, John Wiggins was placed under arrest and formally charged. The inquest was adjourned until he could be well enough to attend in person, to hear the evidence for himself and face the mounting accusations. When the proceedings resumed, Wiggins was brought under police escort from the House of Detention to the Coroner's Court in Limehouse. Crowds had already gathered, thousands strong, jostling for a glimpse of the man at the centre of this grisly case that had transfixed all of East London. From the Globe, the 9th of August, 1867, the alleged horrible murder at Limehouse. This morning, Mr. Richards, the Deputy Coroner, resumed at the Salisbury Arms Tavern in Eastfield Street, Limehouse, the inquiry touching the alleged murder of Agnes Oaks, aged 23 years. At 9 o'clock this morning, the prisoner John Wiggins was placed in a prison van and driven to the coroner's court. The crowd which awaited his arrival at the court numbered several thousand persons, and the greatest excitement prevailed. When the prisoner alighted from the van, the rush and pushing of the crowd was so great that the police had some difficulty in making a narrow pathway through the dense mass of men, women, and even children who were all desirous of getting a glance at the prisoner. John Wiggins, aged 35 years, was brought into the court by the police. He is a man of florid complexion and is 5 feet in height. He smiled and looked around the crowded court, every eye being turned towards him. He then sat down and, crossing his legs, watched his solicitor as he was examining the witnesses called for the defence. John Wiggins's parents were called, both eager to defend their son and, in doing so, to shift the tone of the inquiry. George Wiggins, a 77-year-old bargeman, testified that Agnes had lived with them at Temperance Cottage for 6 months. He described her as not immoral, only given to drink, and said that while quarrels were frequent, none had turned violent. On the Tuesday night, he claimed, all had been cheerful. His son had gone out briefly on a job and returned home around 1 in the morning, asking to be awoken early for work. Then, just before dawn, the elder Wiggins said he heard a faint cry, "Oh, oh, oh," which he took for a man's voice. And a moment later his son burst from the bedroom with a red handkerchief round his neck, crying, "Father, Aggie has cut my throat." When the mother, Martha Wiggins, ran upstairs, she found Agnes on the floor, grievously wounded. John followed soon after, exclaiming, "Save her, father! Poor girl! Save her!" Both parents maintained that Agnes's drinking and despondency were to blame for the tragedy. George added, with a touch of self-pity, that he had paid for her burial out of his own pocket. The testimony of Wiggins's parents, although lengthy, did little to clarify the facts. It painted instead a picture of steadfast loyalty, an aging mother and father desperate to preserve their son's innocence, even as the evidence of violence lay at their feet. Their words turned the inquest from inquiry to defence, filled less with revelation than with reassurance. Agnes, they said, had been given to drink and prone to melancholy. Their son, industrious and affectionate, had been the victim, not the aggressor. Yet their recollections contradicted one another in small but telling ways, and the jury seemed unconvinced. Once more the discussion returned to the medical evidence, the position of the body, the dreadful wound, and the question that hung over the room. Could such an injury have been self-inflicted? Dr. Horton, recalled to the stand, responded firmly, "No." And then, at last, the moment the Crown Court had been waiting for, the accused himself, John Wiggins, requested to give his own account of the events of that fateful night. Prisoner, at his own request, said on oath, "On the night I left the house at 1:45, I was sober. I knocked at the door of my house. Agnes Oaks opened and I went in. I said I would not go to bed as I wanted to go out at 4:45 the next morning. I lay down in front of the fire and fell asleep. A little after 3 o'clock, my mother came and called me. I then went downstairs. It was then 20 minutes past 4. I went to see her drawer again, and Agnes came to my side and on her knees said, 'Oh, do forgive me.' And I said, 'I can't.' I then lay down and went to sleep. I was awoken by a tickling in my throat. I put my hand and caught her, and after a little time I got her hand away. My left thumb was cut, and I got up and went into my father's room and said, 'Agnes has cut my throat.' I did not know that she had cut her own throat. I then heard mother say that Agnes had cut her own throat. I then went into the room where I saw Agnes in the corner. The knife was nearby. The chair was close to her, and I took up a pair of drawers and put them to my throat." Coroner: You seduced this young woman under a promise of marriage. Prisoner. No, she was not seduced by me. Coroner. How about that mark under the blade bone? Prisoner. What mark? I only bit her on the side. The coroner summed up at considerable length, and the jury then retired, and after being absent for about half an hour, returned into court, and the foreman said that they had found that Agnes Oaks was found dead with a wound in her throat, and the said jurors do further say that as such a small incision was caused, there is no sufficient evidence to show. The prisoner was then removed, and when he was being carried out to the van, the dense mass of thousands of people kept shouting out, "Open verdict! Open verdict!" The excitement was intense. Despite the jury's open verdict, neither police nor prosecutors were satisfied. The evidence of the throat wound, the timeline, and the contradictions in testimony all pointed, in their view, not to despair, but to deliberate violence. Neighbours were quietly questioned, statements gathered, and small details re-examined. The legal noose slowly but surely was tightening around John Wiggins. Public feeling was fierce, but behind the scenes, detectives continued their work. And soon a new witness would emerge, a dying man whose account cast a darker shadow still over Temperance Cottage that July morning. From the Globe, the 16th of August, 1867, the Limehouse tragedy. Mr. Paget, the magistrate of the Thames Police Court, went yesterday to the house of a man named Conrad Long to take the important evidence respecting the Limehouse tragedy. Long is in the last stages of consumption and is also suffering from sciatica. John Wiggins, the man accused of the murder, was present, and his appearance was the signal for a tremendous yell of execration from the spectators. The oath having been administered to Mr. Long in his bed, he said, "I remember the morning of the 24th of July. At 2 o'clock my wife gave me some medicine. I afterwards fell asleep and was awoke by a hollering and cries of murder. It was then between the lights. I looked out of the window, which is close to my bed, and I saw the prisoner's mother, who was hollering out murder. She came out of her house and into the street and called murder 2 or 3 times and then walked in again. She had a knife in her hand. It looked a longish knife. I'm sure it was a knife. After a little while, the prisoner came out of the house. I saw him sitting opposite my window on a chair. It might be 10 or 15 minutes from the time the old woman came out. My wife was awake when the prisoner came out. The clock was going, but I did not look at it. The prisoner's mother had a gown on, not a white night dress. It was not light enough to see what colour the gown was. With the quietly accumulated evidence, the witness statements, the medical findings, and the inconsistencies in his account, John Wiggins was at last formally charged with the wilful murder of his lover, Agnes Oaks, and with cutting his own throat on that same July morning. Wiggins, confident in his story and seemingly assured by the loyalty of his parents, appeared far from alarmed. If anything, he carried himself with a kind of stubborn composure, even a hint of defiance. Outside the Thames Police Court, tempers ran high. A large crowd pressed against the doors, eager for a glimpse of the accused. When the court reopened after a brief adjournment, a rush ensued, men and women struggling shoulder to shoulder for admission. When John Wiggins was finally led inside, he appeared thinner and paler than before, yet maintained what one reporter called a jaunty and defiant air. The prosecution began to build its case upon a series of quiet but devastating contradictions. Wiggins maintained that the struggle had taken place around 5 o'clock that morning, that Agnes had attacked him in a frenzy, and that by the time the police arrived, she had been dead for no more than half an hour. But neighbours swore that they heard the cries of murder from the house some 3 hours earlier, between 2 and 3 o'clock. When the body was examined, it was already cold at the extremities, rigor mortis having begun to set in, and the blood was dry, and there were not any signs. These were not the signs of a recent death. Then there was the position of the body, the face covered by a chair, and the dreadful wound itself. The throat had been cut from ear to ear, the knife twisted within the neck so violently that it had reached the spine. Such an act, the surgeons agreed, could not have been self-inflicted. And while Agnes' injuries were catastrophic, the wounds upon Wiggins were shallow, mere scratches compared to the savagery of hers. It seemed improbable that a woman of her mild and gentle temperament had inflicted both the attack and her own destruction in one burst of fury. Throughout it all, Wiggins maintained a strange, jaunty composure, thinner and paler from his time in custody, but still defiant. He insisted he was innocent and asked that his witnesses be heard at trial. From the Globe, the 26th of September, 1867. The Limehouse tragedy. In the new court this morning, the trial of John Wiggins, 34, for the wilful murder of Agnes Oaks was continued. Doctors Taylor and Wilkes were called to prove that the deceased woman had been dead at least 5 hours when found. The extremities were partially rigid, and even the parts which were covered were almost cold. Under these circumstances, both the witnesses agreed it was impossible that the deceased had only been dead half an hour, and as asserted by the prisoner. From the Globe, the 26th of September, 1867. Remarkable trial for murder. The trial of Wiggins for the murder of Agnes Oaks at Limehouse on the 24th of July commenced yesterday at the Central Criminal Court. The case is invested with unusual interest from the extraordinary character of the defence, namely, that the deceased tried to cut the prisoner's throat while he was asleep, and that on his awakening by the infliction of the wound and rushing out to give an alarm, she then committed suicide. The theory of the prosecution, however, is that the woman was murdered some hours previously to the man giving the alarm, and that his wound was self-made. That at the time when, as they alleged, the deed was done, cries of murder were heard by neighbours. That the cut on the man's throat, supposed to have been inflicted by the woman, was so slight as to betray an infirmity of purpose quite inconsistent with the fearful force by which the wound she died of must have been given, it having suffered all the arteries and vessels and reached the vertebrae. And lastly, that it was impossible for the deceased to have given herself such a wound. A variety of smaller facts are held to bear out this view, as for instance the position in which the body was found, the conduct of the accused, the absence of blood on his neckcloth, the prisoner, who is a man of small build and spare habits of body, did not evince the slightest anxiety as to his position during the entire day. Despite John Wiggins' striking lack of concern over the charge of murdering his 22-year-old lover, the mounting contradictions in the medical testimony and the witness accounts left the jury with no choice but to declare a verdict of guilty. The evidence of timing, temperature, and the dreadful wound itself pointed all one way, to deliberate killing, not self-destruction. Yet outside the courtroom, opinion was divided. London was uncertain whether justice had truly been done. Wiggins himself seemed convinced he had been betrayed, that his own counsel's decision not to call his parents as witnesses had sealed his fate. From the Globe, the 27th of September, 1867. The Limehouse murder. The newspaper, The Standard, considers that all the circumstances of the case points to one way, intended to fix the guilt of the murder upon the accused. The crime, indeed, was so peculiarly cruel and cowardly in its nature that one can well understand how the man who could commit it would also be cool and crafty enough to endeavour to conceal it, or transfer the suspicion of it to the victim, whom he had effectively prevented from telling tales. Society is to be congratulated on having, in this instance, secured the conviction of a murderer for whom no one could have felt the slightest compassion, even if the jury had omitted the recommendation to mercy which they appended to their verdict, and which may yet save the convict from the scaffold on which he would otherwise have ended his days. But not all were convinced. While the Globe and the Standard hailed the verdict as a triumph of justice and reason, proof that even the craftiest deception could not outwit the courts, others were less certain. Some papers questioned whether the case had truly been proved, or whether Wiggins's crime, if crime it was, sprang from rage and despair rather than cold-blooded intent. The Telegraph in particular urged caution. The Telegraph observes that as far as motives were concerned, the evidence told, if anything, on behalf of the prisoner. No conceivable reason could be alleged why he should have desired to take the woman's life with malice. He was in a position where he could cast her off without much difficulty, and he had given her notice to quit on the following day. He had no known cause of jealousy, and although a brutal fellow, he did not seem to be the sort of man who would needlessly commit a crime that must place his own life in jeopardy. The girl, on the contrary, had strong motives for revengeful and murderous feelings. She had been cruelly wronged by the man who had taken her to live with him under the plea that he meant to marry her, and then had not only declined to fulfill his promise, but was sending her out penniless upon the street. If his account could be trusted, she had implored his forgiveness just before her attack upon him, and her appeal had been refused in a way most galling to a passionate woman's feelings. The Telegraph continued. The jury obviously shared the opinion that the real history of the crime had not been stated on either side. The prosecution asserted that a wilful murder had been committed. The accused alleged his total innocence and reiterated his assertion in the most earnest manner after the verdict had been given. But a third supposition is, to say the least, equally tenable with that of absolute guilt or complete innocence. In all probability, there was a fierce quarrel between the man and the woman, which, like previous fights, had begun with blows and ended in the use of knives. Whether the woman attacked the prisoner first, or whether he killed her in a sudden passion, and then, terrified at the consequences of his crime, when he did himself, with the hope of diverting suspicion, may never be known. But in either case, the crime appears to have been manslaughter rather than deliberate murder, and such we assume to be the meaning of the jury's recommendations to mercy on the play that the offence was not premeditated. From the Globe, the 15th of October, 1867. The execution this day. The case of Wiggins' extraordinary scene on the scaffold. John Wiggins was executed this morning at Newgate for the murder of Agnes Oaks, the woman with whom he cohabitated at Limehouse. In the condemned cell, Wiggins had maintained since his conviction the same assertions of his innocence which he made on his trial. He has throughout adhered to his original statement, merely adding, by way of explanation, that the cries of murder said to have been heard at 2 o'clock must have issued from some neighbouring house, not his. Ever since his conviction, he has pointed out to the friends who have seen him that had witnessed being called for the defence. The truth of the story which he told would have been established. It has been shown to him that, having placed his case in the hands of counsel, he was bound to accept the course that was taken. The witnesses alluded to were doubtless the father and the mother of the prisoner, whom Mr. Ribton did not call at the trial, although both were understood to be in attendance. The sheriffs, accompanied by the under-sheriff, arrived at the prison shortly before 8 a.m. and were received by the governors. The culprit, it appeared, had slept soundly and was engaged in prayer with the ordinary, who, at this almost last moment, urged upon the wretched man the necessity of confessing his crime, but he again declared his entire innocence. He was then led by 2 turnkeys from his cell to the room where the ceremony of pinioning was to be performed, and where Calcraft and his assistants were already in attendance. The culprit walked along in a most cool and unconcerned manner. The culprit was then pinioned, and when this had been done, the prisoner said he should like to be allowed to say a few words to the people from the scaffold. The governor told him that this could not be permitted, and that, besides, if he attempted to address the crowd, he could not be heard, and if he wished to say anything, he had better do it then, as representatives of the press were present, and what he said would be made public. The culprit then, in a firm and collected manner and in a loud tone of voice, said, "I am entirely innocent of the crime I am to die for, and suffer the law innocently. I can assure you on my dying oath that I never done it, and I shall die with a clear conscience. I go with a clear heart to my Maker. It was she who cut her own throat. I'm innocent. By my dying words, I'm innocent." He then asked if he wished to say anything more, and he replied, "No, I've only to say that I am innocent." The usual mournful procession then took place to the scaffold, and as there appeared to be an impression prevailing in the minds of the prison officials that the culprit might attempt some act of violence on the drop, a number of orderlies were in attendance in case their assistance should be requested. It was well, as it turned out, that these precautions were taken. The prisoner would not place himself in the spot under the beam as he was requested by Calcraft, but retreated behind it, and while the executioner was in the act of adjusting the rope around his neck, he seized a portion of it with both hands, notwithstanding that he was pinioned. He began to shriek out with frantic energy, "I am innocent, but my dying oath, I am innocent. I never did it. I'm innocent, innocent, innocent." During this time, a violent struggle was going on, as the orderlies were obliged to use all their strength to release the rope from his grasp, and while this was going on, the culprit screamed out, "Don't hang me! Don't hang me! Chop my head off! Cut my head off! I am innocent!" At last the rope was forced out of the grasp of the wretched man, and the end of it was attached to the top beam. But the men were compelled to hold the culprit up on the scaffold while Calcraft went underneath to disengage the apparatus. This was done in very short order, and when the drop fell, the culprit was still screaming, "I am innocent," and the drop fell as the syllable "in" was passing from his lips. He appeared to be dead almost immediately. At least not the slightest convulsive effort was apparent. This may probably be accounted for by the state of exhaustion the prisoner was in, owing to his previous violent exertions. The crowd seemed quite paralysed by the melancholy scene that was taking place up on the scaffold. When the unhappy culprit first made his appearance on the scaffold, there was the buzz that hung in the crowd as usual upon such occasions. But when the prisoner began to speak, there was death-like stillness. No notice appeared to be taken until the prisoner had repeatedly declared that he was innocent, and then there was a slight attempt at groaning and a few hisses, but this was very partial, and when the drop fell, the crowd again relapsed into silence. Further particulars. After all that grim business on the scaffold, let us now turn our attention to something far more wholesome, the time-honoured Halloween tradition of sowing hemp seed alone in a dark foundry in hopes of conjuring your future husband. Because what could possibly go wrong? What follows is a cautionary tale from Cork in 1802, featuring incantations, spectral visions, and the dangers of having an imagination too vivid for your own good. If you were considering communing with the other side this Halloween, this story may persuade you to stick to a slice of pumpkin and a quiet night in. From the Cork Mercantile Chronicle, the 22nd of November, 1802, we give the following particulars from authority, and our informant trusts that they will prove a warning to inconsiderate youth to betake themselves to amusements more rational and less likely to be attended with an unpleasant consequence to themselves. The ceremony of sowing hemp seed on Halloween is known to most of our readers. A young girl of the name of Mabel Carr, servant to Mr. Matthewson, type founder, would need to have her Halloween on Monday week, and, notwithstanding the earnest remonstrances of her master, who represented the impropriety and absurdity of prying into the secrets of futurity, she would not be dissuaded from sowing her hemp seed on that night. About 10 o'clock she accordingly went into the foundry alone, with a light in her hand, which she placed on one of the tables while she performed her incantations. She walked through the shop several times, pronouncing aloud the words used on such occasions, and so anxious was she to see something, as she termed it, that having seen nothing, she gathered up the seed to sow it a second time. In the course of this second sowing, according to her own account, a tall, meagre figure presented itself to her imagination. She shrieked aloud and ran immediately into the house, all the doors being open. After relating all that she had seen, she went to bed, placing the Bible under her head. She rose on Tuesday and went through the labours of the day in apparently good health, but in the evening appeared somewhat timid. She, however, had her supper as usual and went to bed without any symptoms of fear. Next morning she was called, but did not answer. Again was called, but still no answer. A daughter of Mr. Mathewson then rose and went to her and found that she was very sick and that she had been so during part of the night. Tea was ordered for her, but before it could be prepared, she was seized with a stupor. The pulse became sunk and breathing difficulty, and the hands swollen and blackish. A medical gentleman was instantly called. He said it was an attack of an apoplexy, which she could not survive more than 10 minutes, and in rather less than that time she expired, the blood bursting from her nose, mouth, etc. The surgeon, on being informed of the transactions of Monday night, was clearly of the opinion that the impression made on her imagination by the fancied apparition was the cause of this fatal catastrophe. Attention! Lonely episode recently concluded seeks admiration and companionship to avoid obscurity and algorithmic doom. Should disappointment reign, kindly direct all retributes to the scriptwriter, a figure of fleeting presence who has made themselves distressingly scarce. However, if pleasure was derived and curiosity well fed, the episode politely requests the following marks of affection: like, subscribe, and share with haste and enthusiasm. Eligible recipients include friends, family, curious strangers, and that mysterious figure often glimpsed at the haberdashery. Together, let us ensure this tale is not left to wither in digital solitude, but instead finds new acquaintances to whisper its secrets to. Addendum from the episode's financial department. Those wishing to encourage further historical mischief may do so at our Patreon salon, where early ad-free releases, lost scandals, and additional curiosities wait. Membership grants one the enviable right to say, "I knew them before they were algorithmically fashionable." Visit News of the Times Historical Crime at patreon.com or follow the discreet link below the video and exchange a meagre monthly contribution for considerable immodest quantities of Victorian intrigue. Your patronage keeps the lamp burning, the archives whispering, and the scriptwriter supplied with both ink and indignation. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles, amateur sleuth, retired marmalade taster, and part-time curator of the Museum of Menacing Sideburns.